People are going to be like, this is worse than the BST videos where they're like, okay, go. So awkward, I could cut all that out. Vigatra, verbal behavior. This is the introduction to the verbal behavior part of the BST training. So we've already talked about how the ABCs of behavior are the way we look at all behavior, including behavior that you want to make happen less, behavior that you want to happen more, like skills, and even verbal behavior, which is like another word for talking, speaking, communicating. So ABAs, this is a kind of a review. ABA is the science of analyzing and improving behavior. One of the most important and complex behaviors is verbal behavior. So just because it's so complex doesn't mean that we just ignore it. Verbal behavior analysis involves using ABA to understand and improve language and communication. So there are already people that do this, that analyze behavior. They're called like analyze verbal behavior. They're called, or analyze language. They're called like linguists or speech and language pathologists, or even like logic is involved sometimes when you, I don't know if you remember from like Philosophy 101 where it's like the triangle thing, and like, you know, literature, stuff like that. So if you went to someone off the street and said like, give me an analysis of language, like what do you think they would say? Or like, what does language analysis involve? What would they tell you?
How people sound, like what they sound like, maybe.
Right. Like maybe they would say like, oh, accents, or
the emotion
like inflection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like things.
Like vocal fry.
Yeah.
The vocal fry.
Or even they might say like things like grammar. They would be like, oh, it means thinking about nouns and verbs and like how to rules not to break, or syntax, like the order, or symbolism, like what words mean, or maybe etymology, like the history of certain words, or if you're coming from like a speech and language, even like the parts of your brain or the parts of your mouth that help you make certain sounds and help you engage in language. But the other side of it is those other things are kind of looking at like the actual language itself, like if you took like a dictionary or like a piece of writing, stuff like that. But it's also behavior, so it is like actually an action that people do when you talk, speak, write, read, communicate in other ways, sign, use pictures. So as you would expect, applied behavior analysis focuses on analyzing and improving the act of communicating, which is called verbal behavior. So B.F. Skinner, which is like, haven't gone over this because it's not super important, but is basically the main scientist and thinker behind a lot of ABA and behavior analysis. So he wrote a book called Verbal Behavior where it was like, all right, we're going to tackle the big thing. And so he came up with that word verbal behavior because things like talking, speaking, language, none of them seemed quite right. So he chose this because number one, it emphasizes focus on behavior. Like we're not talking about like words on a page, we're talking about things that people do. And it was broad enough to include different kinds of communication, like speech is the obvious big one, but also like signs count as verbal behavior. Some of our kids use pictures to communicate, and that is still verbal behavior, and like obviously reading and writing. So, oh, why didn't it give me my little thingies? It will. It was supposed to click one at a time. I don't know if it'll show up, but if you can tell, a picture is milk. So rather than focusing on the meaning of a specific word, like milk is that stuff, verbal behavior analysis is interested in the function of a person's verbal behavior, which is kind of different because if you said like, what's the function of milk, you might say like, oh, to drink it, but that's not what we're talking about. So how is this analysis different? Verbal behavior, oh, no. Verbal behavior analysis is interested in why we behave verbally. So if it's more interested, not like what milk means, it means like this white thing in a container that some people like and some people don't like. It means like, why did that person use that word? What was the function of their behavior? And so where do we look to find the why or the function of behavior?
In the environment?
Yeah.
Yes, in the environment, which is like all back to ABCs. So with you ABA people, it's always about the ABCs, which like hopefully that's a point that's come across by now. If you're ever confused about your client's behavior or anyone's behavior, if you can like take a step back and think about what's happening before and after, you might have a much better chance of understanding it. So using the ABCs to analyze verbal behavior, when you look at it this way, oh, this is where it is. The fact that milk equals milk is not helpful, because how can we find the antecedent and the consequence if we don't have a behavior? Because like we just said, the word milk is not a behavior. But someone saying milk is. So what's the antecedent and the consequence for someone saying milk?
Anything is thirsty. Thirsty. The consequence of the drink.
Maybe. Oh, trick question!
Presence of milk.
Yes. So that the reason it's a trick question is kind of like if you said, what's the function of aggression? Trick question. You need to know the antecedent and the consequence. So here's a hypothetical, like it's a trick question for me to ask you that without, if it's a hypothetical situation, I need to tell you.
Right.
If it's a real life situation, you need to see it. So this is like, pretend this is now we have the whole unit, so now what's the function here? Thirst, like you guys, this is what you guys were saying. You were talking about Amand, which we'll get to later. Thirsty baby. And then have you seen when babies use their signs? To me, it's like crazy alien babies. Like, well, what's in there all this whole time? We could have been like, we think you're a lump, but you're like, yeah.
So what's up?
I love it. So baby signs milk, and then they get fed. So now what's the function?
Hunger. Or thirsty.
Thirsty, but what's the reinforcer?
Oh,
Like,
yes,
yeah. So tangible. And then here's another version. This is why it was a trick question. So say you're with a friend and your friend sees a commercial. So this is the friend. It's the friend's behavior we're talking about. Friend sees a commercial for milk and they say, "Ugh, milk." And then you say, "Oh, you don't like milk?" So what's the function there? Attention. Like social engagement, yeah. So what is the function of the word milk? We can't answer that the same way we can't say what the function of aggression is, or we can't say what the function of elopement is without knowing the antecedent and the consequence. So it depends on the context, like we just said. In other words, when we say, Amanda said, where do we look for a function? Amanda said, in the environment. That's another way of saying antecedent and consequence, because antecedents and consequences, like we talked about, are environmental events, even if they come from another person. And you can also call it the context, like if it's the environmental context, it's what happened before and after. So like we talked about, the function for the baby signing milk is access, and then the function for the guy saying like, "Ugh, milk, gross," is attention or conversation. So instead of categorizing verbal behavior into groups like nouns, adjectives, verbs, Skinner organized them into categories based on what we just talked about, the circumstances under which they occur, which is the antecedents, and the consequences which they produce. Because you can know, if you're trying to help a kid learn to talk, if you're trying to teach it, you have to understand the function and the motivation. So telling them that like this word means milk is not going to help you. So these categories, at the time, they were completely new. So they're, number one, they're like new words that are probably you've never heard of. So the words themselves were new things that Skinner kind of made up, and also like the whole way of thinking it was something new, which is kind of crazy because like thousands of years of philosophers and everything, and nobody ever thought to think of behavior or think of language and verbal behavior like as behavior, and to look at like why it happens. So this is what they are: manned, tact, echoic, interverbal. Those are the kind of the main and most important ones that you are going to need to know about, because you'll see these things in our kids' programming. We're going to talk much more about them later. Manned is derived from things like demand and command. Tact is kind of related to the word contact. Echoic obviously is like an echo, and then interverbal is kind of called that because it comes between other verbal behavior. If you ever hear anybody call them a verbal operant, that's the same thing. So it's basically, these are like types of utterances. Instead of talking about like nouns, verbs, adjectives, we talk about these things. So we're going to talk about each one in detail later, but for now, here, someone couldn't figure out how to spell. So here's the ABC unit that defines each one. So each one is not defined by like, oh, mans, these are some examples of mans. Candy, food, cup, ball. No, you can't tell from the word itself. You have to tell by the ABC unit. So each one has its own defining thing. So a mand, this is what's important about a mand. The antecedent is a want or a need, which is unique for a mand. The behavior is basically like it's some kind of request for something. When you say, it doesn't specify what it sounds like or what it looks like. It could be like, give me the water, I'll kill you. Or it could be like, can I have some water, please? Like both of those are mans. And for other reasons, we do focus on the form of the man, but for why we call it a man, it doesn't matter. And then the reinforcement, this is also important, is the thing requested. So when you're, so when the guy said like, ew, milk, he didn't want milk to be given to him. That's not his reinforcement. His reinforcement was he was just making conversation, and he wanted the person to like say like, oh yeah. When you're making a man, you want the thing. So if I say like, hey, can I get a cheeseburger with fries? And then the server says like, good job ordering, and gives me like a pat on the head and a cookie. Like that's not what I wanted. I wanted a cheeseburger and fries. And then attacked. That's why it's derived from words like demand and command, because it's like I demand this thing and I command you to give me a cheeseburger and fries. Attacked. The antecedent is, this is kind of weird to think about, but it's something in the nonverbal environment, and all that really means is that anything other than someone's verbal behavior. So like, if I'm responding because, like if I say a ball, but I say it because somebody said like, what's your favorite thing to play with? I didn't see a ball. I'm not talking about a ball over there. I'm responding to the fact that they asked me a question. And then the behavior is saying the corresponding thing. So these are things like, I see a computer and I say like, that's a computer. Or if I see it's raining outside, I say like, oh gosh, it's raining. Or if I see an accident on the freeway, I say like, oh no, there's an accident. I hope everyone's okay. Those are all tacts because you're responding to something that you see in the environment. And then GCR, we're going to talk about this later, but it means generalized condition reinforcers or reinforcement. And what all it really means is that it's not that specific reinforcement that comes from a mand. So that is when it's like social approval, social engagement, like keep going, it doesn't have to be this like, good job. It could just be like, the guy's like, oh, I hate milk. And like, oh, I don't mind it. Like that's reinforcement for attack. Echoic. For this one is kind of unique because the antecedent is somebody else's vocal verbal behavior. Most of the other operants, it doesn't matter the form. Like you can be using signs, you can be using pictures, you can be using like Pig Latin, it doesn't matter. for echoic, we are talking about actual like vocal behavior. You can't, like if somebody shows you a picture of a mountain and then you hold up a picture of a mountain, that's not really an echoic. That's like, I don't know what that is. Then it becomes just imitation, yeah. So this is the one where it does matter. It's actual vocal behavior, and then the behavior is basically vocal imitation, and the reinforcement is that same GCR, like it's just something very like social interaction or social continuation, something like that. Intraverbals, these are ones that get like, this one's kind of a tricky one for people to understand because it's kind of like the dump bucket for everything else that's not attacked in an echoic. The main point is that the antecedent is somebody else talking to you. So mostly things like answering questions and responding to like bids for conversation or comments, and also like fill-ins. Like if you said like twinkle twinkle little, and then I said star, that would be intraverbal because was it a nonverbal thing in the environment? No, like I didn't see a star and say like, oh cool, a star. I heard you talking, and I responded to that, and then I talked. And then so corresponding response seems kind of vague, but that's because it could be anything. There's no requirement for the form. It doesn't have to. It could be anything as long as it's appropriate for this. And then that GCR is the same reinforcer. We're going to talk more about what that is later, so don't worry if you're like, I don't know what that means. And then this is not technically verbal behavior, but listener behavior is still important. So listener behavior is not the same as verbal behavior, but the person is not, because the person is not speaking or otherwise communicating. But they're also called receptive skills. So basically this means you are responding to somebody talking, and you're responding in a way that demonstrates that you understand what they said. So if somebody said like, Hannah, jump up and down, and I jumped, that's listener behavior because jump matches what I did. But I'm not engaging in verbal behavior because I'm not communicating anything to them. But it does show that I do understand what they're trying to tell me. So if you're familiar with like in like a lot like the speech and language kind of world, they call it receptive expressive. If you're familiar with that, it means the same thing. So expressive language means actually talking or signing or giving a picture, and receptive language means like receiving what the person is saying and understanding it. They basically correspond to expressive language is verbal behavior, and receptive language is listener behavior. So if you see that sometimes in your, the reason this is kind of important is because if you see this in your programming with your kids, like if it says like receptive identification of objects, that because it's receptive, like they're not talking. They're only responding to what you say. So if you say like, which one is the bat? They touch the bat. If you see expressive identification of objects, they're talking. So you say, what is this? That's the big difference. And you'll see that in your programming. Or if you see tact programming, that's verbal behavior, so it means they're talking. So you say, what is this? If you see listener responding, naming object or identifying objects, that's when you say like, which one is a ball? So listener behavior is closely related.
I think expressive language can be used for like devices. And
yes.
It's not necessarily your voice.
It's not talking, but like whatever talking means for that person, like it might be signing or using, yeah, I say pictures, but pictures are turning into communication devices. It's a similar kind of like setup. So like I said, listener behavior is closely related to verbal behavior because it does involve understanding someone's talking. And usually when someone's talking, they're not talking by themselves. It's usually like a listener speaker. So it's very closely related, but it's not verbal behavior. The listener behaves in a way that is appropriate with respect to the speaker's behavior. So if like you say, hi Hannah, and I just like, and I say, oh no, I don't say anything, that's not a good one. If you say, Hannah, can you throw this in the trash for me, please? And I like don't, then I'm not demonstrating that I have listener behavior. So practical application, this gets very important, as you can imagine. This type of understanding of language as behavior has greatly improved our ability to teach, since a lot of what people learn is related to verbal behavior. Like when you go to school, you're learning well, you're probably not learning, hopefully you already know how to talk, but like you're learning to read and write and communicate, and you're learning to listen to what other people have to say, and especially like what's one of the main deficits for autism is language. Like that's one of like the almost defining deficits. Like a lot of what we're doing when we're treating autism at the center is trying to teach language, because number one, just for itself, that language is a deficit, but then it kind of spills over into all these other deficits. Like communication deficits are at the root of a lot of challenging behaviors, and a lot of social deficits too. Like how social can you really be if you don't understand what other people are saying, and if you can't communicate your wants and needs, and if you can't talk to them about your environment. So that language deficit is like the big bad one. Also, language is kind of a pivotal skill, where if you can communicate and understand what people say and communicate to them, you can learn a lot more things. You can learn that somebody tells you like, hey, this is a pterodactyl, and like now you know what a pterodactyl is. So valuable language. So there kind of implications for teaching. This kind of tells us, like, you know, if we're thinking just from like, oh, this is language, I need to tell this kid, I need to increase their vocabulary. We see this with a lot of our kids, like they have a huge vocabulary. But just because they can say a word or even know what object it corresponds to doesn't mean that they can use it. So this is something that's kind of been seen in the research. Like just because a kid knows, they say, what is this? It's candy. Okay, cool. And then it's time for the kid when they want the candy, and then they start banging their head on the table. So they don't use it as a man. They only use it as tact. And this is something that you see with autism. So, and just because a learner can use a word for one, this is what I was talking about, use a word for one operant, doesn't mean they necessarily mean they can use it for another. And this includes listening behavior. Just because a kid understands what you're telling them doesn't mean that they can say what something is or ask for it. They're totally different behaviors that happen under different circumstances. So we use this, and we, instead of like a typically developing kid where they just kind of like, they just sort of almost, it's not magical, but it's just that they have those prerequisite cells where they learn mans and tacts, and they learn it as a man, that now they can tact it, they learn it as a tact, now they can man for it. For our kids, a lot of times we need to teach like this, we're teaching this word as a man, and now we're teaching it as a tact, and now we're teaching it as listener behavior, because they need it. And it also helps our understanding of motivation, because a lot of times what do you do in school? Maybe if you're learning new vocabulary, it's like flashcards. But like what verbal behavior tells us about motivation is that ABC unit. For a man, it's a want or a need, and then the reinforcer is that thing. So now that we know that, we can effectively teach requesting, because we can do it when you want something. And same thing with tact. It's like a lot of kids have, like they have a lot of tacts. Like if you say, what is it, 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 they could say any object. But if you sit them in a room with somebody, they just sit there. And like, why is this? It's because they're not, that GCR, that like social reinforcement, they're not motivated to get that. Like if you've ever been around a baby, like a toddler, they're like, doggy, because their mom's like, you're so smart. And like for kids with autism, that social reinforcement is not necessarily a thing. So if you want to see spontaneous tacting, you need to work on having that kid care about social praise. And then we can also, this is where it gets like really juicy and good. What you want to see from our kids is, you don't want to have to teach, like, so I have milk is the word, I'm going to teach them to ask for milk, and that's going to take, 10 weeks, and I'm going to teach them to say milk when they see a picture, and that's going to take 6 weeks, and then I'm going to teach them to say milk when I say milk. You want it to be like, so say I said, I have a kid and I'm coloring, and I say like, this color is called neon green, something the kid has never, like the kid's never heard the word neon before. And so then I hold it and I withhold it from them, and I say like, hey, can you draw me like a nuclear reactor plant, please? And like, I have the green, and the kid has never manded for neon green before, so they don't have it as a mand, but I tacted it to them. I said, this is neon green. I'm like, draw me a nuclear reactor, and all the kid has is like brown and red. And then this is a typically developing kid, so they say like, and I have it in my hand and I'm holding it, and they say like, can you pass me the neon green? So like, that's what we want from our kids. We want to just like be able to label it for them and like just more like a natural instruction kind of a format, which is how everybody else learns. Like, you don't, like a typically developing adult, professor lectures in a classroom, and like now they can use all that stuff for all these different functions. So sometimes we can actually do this, and that's where we get those like snowballing autism gains, where it's like now they're learning from their natural environment because they can do things like ask questions and hear something and then use it. So to review, verbal behavior is not concerned as much with the words and phrases themselves as with the context of their occurrence. And this also, I said words or phrases because we're really not concerned with whether it's a word or a phrase. Like if you say like, can I have milk please? And it's because you want milk. Or if you say milk and that's also because you want milk, both of those are manned. Like you can analyze at a word level or you can analyze at a sentence level, but basically understanding like what level does it make the most sense to understand what you're doing. Like, so if somebody said, can I have milk please? It makes more sense to understand that sentence as a mand than to say like, well, what's the function of can, and what's the function of I, and what's the function of milk? Like, don't get too caught up in that kind of thing. You just want to say like, what's happening? Like, why are you saying this? So the main verbal operants that we're going to talk about are mands, tacts, echoics, and interverbals. Listener behavior is also important, but it is not actually verbal behavior itself. Listener behavior demonstrates that you can understand what somebody else is saying and behave appropriately. And then this analysis of language has been super, super huge in the treatment of autism and as far as teaching language.